The young mother's hands trembled as she held out her woven basket to passing strangers in the dusty market square of White Pine, Nevada. Her voice barely above a whisper as she asked for anything they could spare. Helena Tucker had been standing there since dawn, her 3-year-old daughter Sarah clinging to her worn skirts, both of them exhausted from hunger and the relentless sun beating down on them. She had never imagined her life would come to this when she married Robert Tucker 2 years ago, but fever had taken him just 3 months past, leaving her with nothing but debts and a child to feed. The basket remained empty despite her pleas, and she could feel the judgmental stares of the townspeople who whispered about her as they walked by, wondering why such a young woman would lower herself to begging instead of finding proper work. Keith Dalton had just finished selling a herd of cattle to the local rancher when he spotted the young woman in the market square, her shoulders hunched in defeat as person after person ignored her quiet requests for help. He was 26 years old, weathered from years working cattle drives from Texas to Nevada, and something about the desperate scene before him made his chest tighten with sympathy. The little girl at the woman's side looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes despite the obvious hunger in her small face, and Keith found himself walking toward them before he even realized what he was doing. He had grown up poor himself, knew what it felt like to go to bed with an empty stomach, and he could not walk past someone in such clear need. "Madam," he said softly, removing his worn hat as he approached. Helena looked up at him with startled eyes, green as spring grass, and he could see the mixture of hope and wariness in her expression. She was young, probably no more than 21 or 22, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid, and a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollow exhaustion in her features. "I would like to help you fill that basket if you would allow me." Helena stared at the tall cowboy standing before her, uncertain whether to trust this stranger's kindness. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered help without expecting something in return, but there was something genuine in his brown eyes that made her want to believe him. "I cannot pay you back," she said quietly, her voice thick with shame. "I have nothing to offer in return for your generosity." "I am not asking for anything in return," Keith replied, his voice steady and kind. "Sometimes folks just need a bit of help, and I happen to have had a good sale today. Let me do this for you and your daughter." He knelt down to be at eye level with little Sarah, who had been watching him with curious blue eyes. "What is your name, little one?" "Sarah," the girl whispered, pressing closer to her mother's leg. "That is a beautiful name," Keith said with a gentle smile before standing back up. "My name is Keith Dalton. Now let us go fill that basket with some good food for you both." He gestured toward the market stalls that lined the square, where vendors sold everything from fresh bread to vegetables and dried goods. Helena hesitated for only a moment before nodding, and Keith could see the relief that flooded her features even as she tried to maintain her dignity. They walked together through the market, and Keith quickly realized just how dire Helena's situation must have been. She barely spoke as he led her from stall to stall, filling her basket with flour, beans, salt pork, fresh eggs carefully wrapped in paper, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, potatoes, carrots, and even a small jar of honey that made Sarah's eyes light up with wonder. Helena protested weakly when Keith added a small sack of cornmeal and some coffee, but he waved away her concerns with a shake of his head. "You need to keep your strength up," he said firmly. "A growing child needs her mother healthy and strong." He paid for everything with the money from his cattle sale, ignoring the way Helena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she watched her basket fill with more food than she had seen in weeks. The other shoppers watched them with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. But Keith paid them no mind, focused entirely on making sure Helena and her daughter would have enough to eat for at least a few weeks. When the basket was full to overflowing, Keith took it from Helena's arms despite her protests. "This is too heavy for you to carry," he said practically. "Where do you live? I will walk you home and make sure you get there safely with all this food." Helena looked like she might refuse, pride warring with practicality on her face, but finally she nodded and began walking toward the edge of town, Sarah holding her hand and Keith following with the heavy basket. As they walked, Keith learned more about Helena's situation. Her voice was soft but steady as she told him about Robert's death, about the debts he had left behind that she had been slowly trying to pay off by taking in washing and mending. "But it is not enough," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "The landlord wants his rent, and I had to choose between paying him and feeding Sarah this week. I chose feeding my daughter, but that means we will likely be turned out by week's end." She glanced at Keith, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I am sorry. You did not ask to hear my troubles." "Do not apologize," Keith said firmly. "Sometimes it helps to tell someone, and I am glad to listen." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, before he spoke again. "What kind of work did your husband do before he passed?" "He was a clerk at the general store," Helena replied. "We had a small house on the edge of town, but I could not afford to keep it after he died. Now Sarah and I rent a single room above the seamstress shop, or we did, until I could no longer pay for it." She pointed ahead to a narrow staircase on the side of a weathered building. "That is where we stay, for now at least." Keith followed her up the stairs, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, and waited as she unlocked the door to a tiny room that held little more than a narrow bed, a small table with one chair, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. The space was clean but sparse, and Keith could see that Helena had done her best to make it a home for her daughter despite their circumstances. A few wildflowers in a chipped cup sat on the windowsill, and a small rag doll lay on the bed, clearly handmade with love if not skill. He set the basket on the table, and Helena immediately began unpacking it with trembling hands, arranging everything carefully as if the food might disappear if she did not handle it properly. Sarah had climbed onto the bed and was watching everything with wide eyes, and Keith felt his heart clench at the sight of how thin the child was. No one should have to live like this, especially not a young mother trying her best to care for her daughter. "Madam," he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "I work at the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles outside of town. The owner's wife passed last year, and he has been looking for someone to help with the cooking and cleaning at the main house. The pay is fair, and it comes with room and board in a small cabin on the property. I could speak to him on your behalf if you would be interested." Helena turned to stare at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would do that for me, but you do not even know me. Why would you help a stranger this way?" Keith met her gaze steadily. "Because everyone deserves a chance to get back on their feet, and because I can see you are a good mother who is doing her best in hard circumstances. That is enough for me." He hesitated before adding, "And to be honest, madam, I would like to know that you and your daughter are safe and cared for. It would ease my mind considerably." Something in his tone made Helena's breath catch, and she found herself looking at this cowboy with new eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, no pity, just genuine concern and kindness. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, had offered help without expecting something in return, that she felt tears finally spill down her cheeks. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "You have given us hope when I had none left." "No thanks needed," Keith said, though he felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. I will ride out to the ranch this evening and speak with Mr. Patterson. Can I come back tomorrow to let you know what he says?" When Helena nodded, he placed his hat back on his head and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob and turned back. "One more thing. How much do you owe your landlord?" Helena hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. $30 for the back rent," she admitted quietly. "But I cannot ask you to pay that. You have already done too much." "You did not ask. I am offering." Keith pulled out his wallet and counted out the money, placing it on the table before Helena could protest. "Pay your landlord and keep this roof over your heads until we can get you moved out to the ranch. I will be back tomorrow afternoon." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and left before she could argue, his boots echoing on the stairs as he descended. Helena stood in the middle of her small room, staring at the money and the basket full of food, feeling as though she had just experienced a miracle. Sarah climbed down from the bed and came to stand beside her, tugging on her skirt. "Is the nice man going to come back, Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart," Helena said softly, picking up her daughter and holding her close. "I think he is." She carried Sarah to the window and watched as Keith's tall figure disappeared down the dusty street, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to feel something other than despair. She felt hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. That evening, Keith rode out to the Double Bar Ranch as the sun was setting, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple. He had been working for Henry Patterson for 3 years now, ever since he had drifted into White Pine looking for steady work after years of driving cattle. The ranch was one of the largest in the area, with good grazing land and a main house that had once been full of life when Mrs. Patterson was alive. Now it was quiet and poorly maintained, with Henry spending most of his time out on the range to avoid the emptiness of his home. Keith found Henry in the barn, checking on a mare that was about to foal. The older man looked up when Keith entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Dalton, did not expect to see you back until tomorrow. How did the sale go in town?" "Got a fair price for the cattle," Keith replied, leaning against a stall door. "But I actually came back to talk to you about something else. You still need help at the main house." When Henry nodded, looking curious, Keith continued. "I met a young widow in town today. She has a little girl about 3 years old and she is in a bad way. Her husband died a few months back and left her with nothing but debts. She is hardworking and respectable, just down on her luck. I thought she might be a good fit for the position." Henry studied Keith's face for a long moment, and Keith could see the wheels turning in the older man's head. "You got a personal interest in this widow?" he asked bluntly. Keith felt his ears grow warm but met Henry's gaze steadily. "I helped her today because it was the right thing to do, but I will admit, there is something about her that makes me want to see her and her daughter safe and cared for. She is young, probably around 22, and she has been through a lot. She just needs a chance." "Well, the house is falling apart around me without Clara to manage it," Henry admitted with a sigh. "I cannot cook worth a damn and the place is a mess. If this woman is willing to work and you vouch for her, I am willing to give her a try. She can have the cabin by the creek. It is small but sound, and it has a good stove and a couple of bedrooms. The pay is $20 a month plus room and board for her and the child." Relief flooded through Keith. "Thank you, Henry. I will bring her out tomorrow if she is agreeable." He paused, then added, "I appreciate you trusting my judgment on this. You have been a good hand and a good man in the time I have known you, Keith," Henry said, clapping him on the shoulder. "If you say this woman deserves a chance, that is good enough for me. Besides, I could use someone to make sure this place does not fall down around my ears. Clara would be spinning in her grave if she could see how I have let things go." Keith left the barn feeling lighter than he had all day. He made his way to the bunkhouse where he slept with the other ranch hands, but sleep was slow to come that night. He kept seeing Helena's face in his mind, the way her green eyes had shimmered with tears when he paid for the food, the fierce love in her expression when she looked at her daughter. He had never been the marrying kind, had always figured he was too restless and rough around the edges for a settled life. But something about Helena Tucker had gotten under his skin in a way he could not quite explain. The next afternoon, Keith rode back into White Pine with a borrowed wagon, hoping Helena would agree to come out to the ranch. He had spent the morning helping Henry air out the cabin by the creek, sweeping out the dust and cobwebs and making sure the stove was in working order. It was a simple place, just 2 small bedrooms, a main room with a kitchen area and a front porch that overlooked the creek, but it was clean and sound and far better than the single room Helena was renting now. He climbed the narrow stairs to her door and knocked, his hat in his hands. Helena answered quickly, as if she had been waiting for him, and Keith was struck again by how pretty she was despite her worn clothes and tired face. She had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night, but there was also a spark of hope in her expression that had not been there yesterday. "Mr. Dalton," she said, stepping back to let him in. "Please come in. I have been thinking about your offer all night." Sarah was sitting at the small table, carefully eating a piece of bread with honey, and she gave Keith a shy smile when he entered. "I spoke with Mr. Patterson last evening," Keith said, returning Sarah's smile before turning his attention to Helena. "He would like to offer you the position if you are willing. The pay is $20 a month, plus a cabin for you and Sarah and all your meals. You would be responsible for cooking and cleaning at the main house and helping with the laundry and mending. It is hard work, but honest work, and you would not have to worry about where your next meal was coming from." Helena's hand flew to her mouth, and Keith could see she was fighting back tears. $20 a month and a cabin," she repeated, as if she could not quite believe it. "Mr. Dalton, that is more than generous. Are you certain Mr. Patterson wants to hire someone he has never met?" "I vouched for you," Keith said simply. "And Henry Patterson is a good man who trusts my judgment. He needs the help and you need the work. It seems like a fair arrangement to me." He hesitated, then added, "I have a wagon waiting outside. If you are agreeable, I can take you and Sarah out to the ranch today so you can see the place and meet Mr. Patterson. If it does not suit you, I will bring you back to town. No questions asked." Helena looked around the tiny room that had been her home for the past few months, at the sparse furnishings and the peeling paint on the walls, and then down at Sarah, who was watching her mother with those trusting blue eyes. She thought of the empty basket she had carried to the market yesterday, of the desperate fear that had consumed her as she watched her daughter grow thinner each day, and she knew there was really only one answer she could give. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I would like to come see the ranch. And if Mr. Patterson finds me suitable, I will work harder than anyone he has ever employed. I promise you that." She began gathering their few belongings, folding Sarah's nightgown and the rag doll, wrapping their tin plates and cups in a cloth. It took less than 15 minutes to pack everything they owned into a single worn carpet bag, and Keith felt a pang of sorrow at how little this young woman and her daughter had to their names. He carried the carpet bag down to the wagon while Helena locked the door for what she hoped would be the last time. She had already paid the landlord that morning with the money Keith had given her, and the man had been surprised but pleased to receive his overdue rent. She had not told him she was leaving, had simply paid what she owed and walked away, and now she felt a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement as Keith helped her up onto the wagon seat before lifting Sarah up to sit between them. The ride out to the Double Bar Ranch took about an hour, and Keith spent the time pointing out landmarks and telling Helena about the ranch and its history. Henry Patterson had built it up from nothing 20 years ago, had married his sweetheart Clara, and brought her west to make a life together. They had never been able to have children, which had been a sorrow to them both, but they had poured their love into the ranch and into each other. When Clara died of pneumonia the previous winter, Henry had been devastated, and the ranch had suffered from his grief. "He is a good man," Keith told Helena as the wagon bounced along the rutted road. "A bit gruff sometimes, but fair and honest. He will treat you right, I promise you that." He glanced at her, seeing the way she held Sarah close and studied the landscape around them with careful attention. "Have you always lived in White Pine?" "No," Helena replied. "I grew up in Missouri on a small farm. My parents died when I was 16, and I had no other family, so I came west with a wagon train looking for work. I met Robert in Carson City when I was working as a seamstress. He seemed kind and stable, offered me a life I thought would be secure." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "He was a good man, truly he was. He loved Sarah and he tried his best, but he was never quite able to make ends meet, and when he got sick, there was no money for a doctor. By the time I realized how serious it was too late." "I am sorry for your loss," Keith said sincerely. "It cannot have been easy, losing your husband and being left to fend for yourself and your daughter in such circumstances." "It has been the hardest thing I have ever done," Helena admitted. "But I would do anything for Sarah. She is my whole world." She looked down at her daughter, who had fallen asleep against her side, lulled by the motion of the wagon. "I just want to give her a good life, the kind of childhood I had before my parents died. A safe place to grow up, enough to eat, maybe even a chance at some schooling someday." "The ranch has a good library," Keith offered. "Mrs. Patterson was an educated woman, loved to read. When Sarah is old enough, I am sure Henry would not mind if you borrowed books to teach her. And White Pine has a schoolhouse now. The teacher is a good woman, very patient with the children." They arrived at the ranch as the sun was reaching its peak in the sky, and Helena's breath caught at the sight before her. The main house was large and well built, with a wide porch and windows that sparkled in the sunlight. Beyond it, she could see corrals and barns, grazing cattle dotting the hillsides, and a small cabin nestled near a creek that wound through the property. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, and Helena felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of so much open space after months cramped in that tiny room above the seamstress shop. Keith drove the wagon up to the main house, where Henry Patterson stood waiting on the porch. He was a man in his late 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working in the sun and wind. His eyes were kind but sad, and Helena could see the grief that still clung to him like a shadow. He came down the steps as Keith helped Helena and Sarah from the wagon, removing his hat politely. "Mrs. Tucker," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Keith tells me you might be interested in helping out around here. I will be straight with you. I need someone who can cook decent meals, keep the house from falling apart, and help with the general running of the household. The work is not easy, but it is steady, and I pay fair wages. You would have the cabin by the creek for you and your daughter, and you would take your meals with me in the main house. Does that sound agreeable to you?" Helena straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "Mr. Patterson, I am a hard worker and a quick learner. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. I will not let you down if you give me this chance. My daughter and I need a fresh start, and I promise you will not regret hiring me." Henry studied her for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes and the way she held her sleeping daughter protectively. He glanced at Keith, who gave a slight nod, and then back at Helena. "All right then. The job is yours if you want it. Keith can show you the cabin and help you get settled. You can start tomorrow if that suits you. Thank you, Mr. Patterson, Helena said, relief and gratitude flooding her voice. Thank you so much. You will not regret this, I swear it. See that I do not, Henry replied, but there was the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Keith, show her the cabin and make sure she has everything she needs. If there is anything lacking, let me know and we will get it sorted. He turned and walked back into the house, and Keith gestured for Helena to follow him toward the cabin. They walked along a worn path that led through a grove of cottonwood trees to the small cabin nestled by the creek. It was even prettier up close than it had looked from the main house, with a solid door and glass windows and a porch just big enough for a chair or two. Keith opened the door and stepped back to let Helena enter first, and she caught her breath at what she saw inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a wood stove in one corner, a table with 4 chairs, shelves for dishes and supplies, and 2 small bedrooms off the main room. Someone had swept the floors and left fresh linens on the beds, and there were even a few wildflowers in a jar on the table, which Helena suspected was Keith's doing. It was the nicest place she had lived since her parents had died, and she had to blink back tears as she set Sarah down on one of the beds and turned to face Keith. "This is wonderful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I cannot believe this is really happening. Yesterday I was begging in the market with an empty basket, and today I have a job and a home and hope for the future. It is all because of you, Mr. Dalton. I will never forget what you have done for us." "Just Keith, please," he said, feeling his ears grow warm again. "And I am glad I could help. You deserved a chance, that is all." He moved toward the door, suddenly feeling awkward in the face of her gratitude. "I will let you get settled in. If you need anything, the bunkhouse is just past the barn. I will be around if you need help with anything." "Keith," Helena called as he was about to leave. He turned back and she crossed the room to stand in front of him. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for seeing me as a person worth helping when everyone else just walked past. You gave my daughter a future, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." Keith looked down at their joined hands, feeling something shift in his chest at her touch. "You are welcome, Helena," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He gently extracted his hand from hers and left before he could do something foolish like pull her into his arms, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the walk back to the barn. Helena watched him go, her hand still tingling from the warmth of his touch, and felt something flutter in her stomach that she had not felt in a very long time. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself not to be foolish. Keith Dalton was a good man who had helped someone in need, nothing more. She could not afford to read more into his kindness than was there, could not risk the security he had helped her find by developing feelings that might not be returned. She had Sarah to think about, and that had to be enough. The next morning, Helena woke early and dressed in her best work dress, determined to make a good impression on her first day. She had braided her hair neatly and pinned it up, and she had made sure Sarah was clean and tidy as well. They walked up to the main house just as the sun was rising, and Helena took a deep breath before knocking on the back door that led to the kitchen. Henry Patterson opened the door, already dressed and looking like he had been up for hours. "Good morning, Mrs. Tucker. Come in, come in. Let me show you where everything is." He led her through the kitchen, pointing out the pantry, the stove, the dishes and pots and pans. "I usually eat breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, and supper at 7. Nothing fancy, just good solid food. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir," Helena replied confidently. "I can handle that just fine. Do you have any preferences or things you particularly like?" "I like just about anything that is not burned," Henry said with a wry smile. "And coffee. Strong coffee with every meal." He showed her through the rest of the house, which was large and rambling with rooms that had clearly not been properly cleaned in months. There was dust on every surface, cobwebs in the corners, and a general air of neglect that made Helena's fingers itch to start scrubbing. "I can see there is much to be done," she said carefully, not wanting to insult him. "I will start with the kitchen and work my way through the house over the coming weeks, and I will make sure you have good hot meals starting today." "That sounds fine," Henry said. "Your daughter can play in the yard while you work, or if you have a corner where she can sit quietly. I do not mind her being in the house. I trust you to manage your time as you see best." He paused, then added more gently, "I know Keith told you about my wife. She ran this household for 20 years, and I have done a poor job of keeping up her standards since she passed. I would be grateful if you could help me honor her memory by bringing this place back to what it once was." "I will do my best, Mr. Patterson," Helena promised. "Your wife must have been a remarkable woman to create such a beautiful home." Henry's eyes grew distant and sad. "She was the best woman I ever knew." He cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders. "Well, I will let you get to work. I will be in and out today, checking on the stock and working with the hands. Keith will be around if you need anything." True to his word, Keith appeared at the kitchen door mid-morning, his hat in his hands and a slight smile on his face. "Just checking to see how your first day is going," he said, his eyes finding Helena where she stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew for the noon meal. Sarah was sitting at the table, playing with her rag doll and humming softly to herself. "It is going well," Helena replied, feeling her heart skip a beat at the sight of him. In the bright morning light, she could see the details she had missed before. The laugh lines around his eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the way his brown hair curled slightly at his collar. "Mr. Patterson has been very kind, and I am starting to get a feel for the house and what needs to be done." "Henry is a good man," Keith said, "and I can already smell the difference. It has been a long time since this house smelled like a home instead of a bachelor's lonely quarters." He stepped further into the kitchen, moving closer to Helena. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed at the cabin. Is the stove working all right? Are the beds comfortable enough?" "Everything is wonderful," Helena assured him. "Better than anything Sarah and I have had in a long time. The cabin is perfect, truly." She stirred the stew, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened with him standing so close. "You have been so kind to us, Keith. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "No repayment needed," Keith said firmly. "Just seeing you and Sarah settled and safe is payment enough." He glanced at Sarah, who was watching them with bright, curious eyes. "How are you doing, little one? Do you like your new home?" "I like it very much," Sarah said shyly. "I can hear the creak from my bedroom, and Mama says maybe I can play by the water when she is not working." "That sounds like a fine idea," Keith agreed. "I could teach you to skip stones on the water if your Mama says it is all right." He looked at Helena for permission, and she felt warmth spread through her at his thoughtfulness in asking. "I think that would be lovely," Helena said softly. "Sarah would enjoy that very much." Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary, and Helena felt that flutter in her stomach again, stronger this time. She forced herself to look away, back down at the stew, her cheeks warming. Keith left soon after, mumbling something about work that needed doing, and Helena tried to focus on her tasks for the rest of the day. But she found her thoughts drifting back to him again and again, to the kindness in his eyes and the gentle way he spoke to Sarah. She scolded herself silently, reminding herself that she was a widow with a child to support, that she could not afford to develop feelings for the cowboy who had helped her. But her heart did not seem to be listening to her head, and by the time evening came, she had admitted to herself that Keith Dalton was unlike any man she had ever met. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Helena rose early each morning to make breakfast for Henry, then spent her days cooking, cleaning, and slowly bringing the house back to its former glory. Henry was a man of few words, but he was generous with his praise when Helena served him a particularly good meal, or when he noticed a room that had been thoroughly cleaned and organized. Sarah thrived in the open air of the ranch, growing rosier and healthier with each passing day, and Helena felt her own strength returning as the constant worry about food and shelter faded. Keith found reasons to come by the main house several times a day, ostensibly to check on things for Henry, but really to catch glimpses of Helena as she worked. He taught Sarah to skip stones by the creek on Sunday afternoons, showed her how to identify wildflowers and spot deer tracks in the soft earth. Helena would watch them from the porch of the cabin, her heart swelling at the sight of her daughter laughing and playing with such joy, and at the patience and gentleness Keith showed her. On one particularly warm afternoon in late summer, about 6 weeks after Helena had come to the ranch, Keith found her hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin. Sarah was napping inside, worn out from a morning spent chasing butterflies, and Helena was humming softly to herself as she worked. Keith stood for a moment just watching her, admiring the way the sunlight caught in her auburn hair and the graceful movements of her hands as she pinned sheets to the line. "Can I help you with that?" he offered, making her jump slightly. She turned to face him, pressing a hand to her chest. "Keith, you startled me. I did not hear you approach." She smiled, and Keith thought it was the most beautiful thing he had seen. The hollow exhaustion had left her face, replaced by a healthy glow and a happiness that made her green eyes sparkle. "And no, thank you, I am nearly finished anyway." "Helena," Keith said, taking a step closer, "can I talk to you about something?" His heart was pounding, and his palms felt sweaty despite the dry heat. He had been working up the courage for this conversation for days now, and he knew if he did not speak his mind soon, he would lose his nerve entirely. "Of course," Helena replied, setting down the laundry basket and giving him her full attention. She could see something was troubling him, could see the nervous energy in the way he held himself. "What is on your mind?" Keith took a deep breath, removed his hat, and ran his hand through his hair. "I know it has not been very long since you came to the ranch, and I know you are still grieving your husband and finding your feet again. But I cannot keep these feelings to myself any longer without feeling like a liar every time I am around you." He met her eyes, his expression earnest and vulnerable. "I have come to care for you a great deal, Helena, and for Sarah too. I find myself thinking about you all the time, looking for excuses to see you, wanting to make you smile just so I can watch the way your whole face lights up." Helena's breath caught in her throat, her heart suddenly racing. "Keith, please let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know I am just a cowboy without much to offer beyond my wages and my word. I know you might not feel the same way about me, and if that is the case, I will step back and leave you be. But I had to tell you how I feel, had to be honest with you about what is in my heart. Because the truth is, Helena Tucker, I am falling in love with you, and I think I have been since the moment I saw you in that market square, holding your empty basket and refusing to give up despite everything against you." Helena stared at him, her eyes wide and shining with tears. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty before, had ever laid their heart at her feet the way Keith was doing now. She thought of Robert, of the comfortable affection they had shared, and realized with a start that what she felt for Keith was something entirely different. It was fierce and bright and consuming in a way her marriage had never been, even in its best moments. "I feel it too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have been trying so hard not to feel it, trying to convince myself that what I feel is just gratitude for everything you have done for us. But it is more than that, so much more. When I see you with Sarah, when you smile at me across the dinner table, when you find reasons to come by just to talk for a few minutes, my heart feels like it might burst. I am falling in love with you too, Keith Dalton, and it terrifies me because I have already lost so much. I do not know if I could survive losing you too." Keith closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and took her hands in his, holding them gently. "You are not going to lose me, Helena. I am not going anywhere. I want to be here for you and Sarah if you will let me. I want to court you properly, to take the time to let you heal, and to let this thing between us grow at its own pace. And someday, if you will have me, I would like to marry you and be a father to Sarah and build a life with you both." "Yes," Helena breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes to all of it. I would like that very much." She laughed through her tears, feeling lighter and happier than she had in years. "How did I get so lucky? How did I go from begging in the market to standing here with a wonderful man telling me he loves me?" "I think I am the lucky one," Keith said, lifting one hand to gently wipe the tears from her cheek. "You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever met, Helena, and I promise you, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you are giving me." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Helena closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his lips against her skin and the solid strength of his presence. When he pulled back, she opened her eyes and smiled up at him. "We should probably tell Sarah. She has been asking me if you are going to be her new papa." Keith laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. "Has she now? Well, I hope I can live up to her expectations. Being a father is something I have always wanted but never thought I would have. I want to do right by both of you." They spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the porch of the cabin, talking about their hopes and dreams and plans for the future. Helena told Keith about her childhood in Missouri, about the happy years before her parents died and the lonely years after. Keith told her about growing up poor in Texas, about the hard work of cattle drives and the lonely nights sleeping under the stars, about how he had always felt like he was searching for something but had not known what until he met her. When Sarah woke from her nap and came outside rubbing her eyes, Keith swept her up in his arms and asked if she would mind if he courted her mama. Sarah squealed with delight and threw her arms around his neck, declaring that she had been hoping he would ask. Helena watched them together, her heart so full of love and gratitude that she thought she might float away, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the day Keith Dalton had walked into the market square and changed their lives forever. Henry Patterson noticed the change in his household immediately. There was a lightness to Helena's step that had not been there before, and Keith walked around with a smile on his face that made the other ranch hands tease him mercilessly. When Keith came to Henry one evening about a month after he had declared his feelings for Helena and asked permission to marry her when the time was right, Henry had laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Son, I have been wondering when you were going to make your intentions clear. A blind man could see you are head over heels for that woman, and she is good for you, I can see that. She is good for all of us." He poured them each a glass of whiskey and raised his in a toast. "To new beginnings and second chances at happiness. God knows we all deserve them." Keith and Helena courted for 6 months, wanting to give Sarah time to adjust to the idea of Keith becoming her father, and wanting to make sure their relationship was built on a solid foundation. They took long walks by the creek on Sunday afternoons, with Sarah running ahead of them catching fireflies. They sat together on the porch in the evenings after Sarah was asleep, talking about everything and nothing, learning the contours of each other's hearts and minds. Keith was patient and gentle, never pushing Helena for more than she was ready to give. He had kissed her for the first time on a crisp October evening, with the stars bright overhead and the sound of the creek bubbling nearby. It had been soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they had pulled apart, Helena had rested her forehead against his and whispered that she loved him. Those 3 words had become easier to say with each passing day, and Keith never tired of hearing them or saying them back. In December, as the first snow began to fall on the Nevada hills, Keith took Helena and Sarah into White Pine to do some shopping for Christmas. He had saved up his wages carefully, and he had a plan that made his heart race with nervous excitement. While Helena was in the general store picking out fabric for a new dress for Sarah, Keith slipped away to the small jewelry shop 2 doors down. The proprietor was an older man named Mr. Chen who had come from San Francisco years ago and settled in White Pine. He had a reputation for fine work and fair prices, and Keith had been corresponding with him for weeks about a special commission. Mr. Chen smiled when Keith entered the shop and immediately went to the back room, returning with a small velvet box. "I finished it yesterday," Mr. Chen said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond set in the center. It was not fancy or extravagant, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and Keith knew immediately it was perfect for Helena. "I think your lady will be very pleased." "It is exactly what I wanted," Keith said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. You do fine work." He paid for the ring, tucked the box carefully into his pocket, and returned to the general store to find Helena and Sarah examining a display of ribbons. That evening, after they had returned to the ranch, and after Sarah had been put to bed with her new storybook and a kiss goodnight, Keith took Helena's hand and led her outside. Fresh snow was falling gently, covering the ground in a blanket of white, and the air was cold and crisp. Helena shivered slightly, and Keith immediately took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Keith, you will freeze," she protested, but he just shook his head. "I will be fine. I need to ask you something, and I am too nervous to be cold." He took both her hands in his breath making small clouds in the frigid air. "Helena Tucker, these past 6 months have been the happiest of my life. You have brought joy and light into my world in ways I never imagined possible. You and Sarah have become everything to me, my whole world and my reason for working to be a better man every single day." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out the small velvet box. Helena gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth as understanding dawned on her face. Keith dropped to one knee in the snow, looking up at her with all the love in his heart shining in his eyes. "Will you marry me, Helena? Will you let me be your husband and Sarah's father? Will you build a life with me and let me spend the rest of my days trying to make you as happy as you have made me?" He opened the box, revealing the ring that sparkled in the moonlight. "Yes," Helena cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." She pulled him to his feet and threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the love and passion she had been holding back during their courtship. Keith wrapped his arms around her waist and lifted her off the ground, spinning her around as they both laughed with pure joy. When he set her back down, he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Helena held her hand up to admire it in the moonlight. "It is beautiful, Keith. It is perfect. You are perfect." She kissed him again, softer this time, and whispered against his lips, "I love you so much. I cannot wait to be your wife." They were married on a bright day in February at the small church in White Pine. Helena wore a simple but elegant dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Sarah had helped pick. Sarah served as flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle with great seriousness, wearing a new dress of blue calico that matched her eyes. Henry Patterson walked Helena down the aisle, having gruffly offered to stand in for her father, and there were tears in his eyes as he placed her hand in Keith's. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with the young minister speaking about love and commitment and the blessing of second chances. When Keith and Helena exchanged their vows, there was not a dry eye in the small church. Keith promised to love and cherish Helena for all his days, to be a good husband and father, to stand by her through whatever trials life might bring. Helena promised to love and honor Keith, to build a home filled with love and laughter, to be his partner in all things. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and told Keith he could kiss his bride, Keith cupped Helena's face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness and love that several of the women in the congregation openly wept. Sarah tugged on Keith's sleeve until he picked her up, and the three of them stood together at the altar, a new family bound by love and choice. The small reception was held at the ranch, with Henry insisting on hosting and the other ranch hands helping to set up tables and chairs in the barn. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat, and Helena felt like she was floating as Keith spun her around the makeshift dance floor. She caught sight of Sarah dancing with Henry, the old rancher's face softer and happier than she had seen it since she arrived, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the way her life had turned around. As the sun set and the guests began to drift away, Keith and Helena stood on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching the stars come out one by one. Keith had his arms wrapped around Helena from behind, and she leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Are you happy?" Keith murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Helena replied honestly. "When I think back to that day in the market when I was so desperate and afraid, I cannot believe this is the same life. You saved us, Keith. You gave us everything." "We saved each other," Keith corrected gently, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "You gave me a purpose and a family and a reason to look forward to tomorrow. You made me believe I could be more than just a drifting cowboy. You made me want to build something lasting and real." They went inside and checked on Sarah, who had fallen asleep in her bed still wearing her flower girl dress, a smile on her face. Helena gently removed the dress and tucked her daughter under the quilts, kissing her forehead softly. Then she took her husband's hand and led him to their bedroom, closing the door behind them and stepping into the next chapter of their life together. The years that followed were good ones, filled with the kind of happiness that comes from hard work and deep love. Helena continued to manage the household at the main ranch house, and Keith worked his way up to foreman, earning the respect of the other hands with his fairness and skill. Sarah grew into a bright, confident girl who loved nothing more than riding horses with her papa and helping her mama in the garden they planted behind the cabin. When Helena discovered she was pregnant a year after their wedding, she was nervous about how Sarah would react to having a sibling. But Sarah was thrilled at the prospect of being a big sister, and she spent months helping Helena prepare the small second bedroom for the new baby. Keith was over the moon with joy, though he tried to hide his worry about Helena's health and the risks of childbirth. Their son was born on a warm September morning, with the local midwife attending and Keith pacing anxiously outside the cabin. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, he burst through the door to find Helena exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft flannel. Sarah was perched on the edge of the bed, staring at her new brother with wide, wonder-filled eyes. "His name is James," Helena said softly as Keith knelt beside the bed and carefully took the baby into his arms. "James Robert Dalton, after my father and my first husband." She looked at Keith with eyes full of love and a hint of worry that he might object to honoring Robert's memory. But Keith just smiled through his tears and kissed her forehead. "That is a fine name, a strong name for our son." He looked down at the baby, at the small face and tiny fingers, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. "Hello, James. I am your papa, and I promise to love you and protect you and teach you to be a good man." 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter they named Clara, after Henry's late wife. Henry had become a surrogate grandfather to all their children, and he had been deeply moved when Keith and Helena asked if they could name their daughter in honor of his Clara. The old rancher held baby Clara with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks and said it was the greatest honor anyone had ever given him. As the children grew, the cabin by the creek became filled with noise and laughter, and the chaos of family life. Sarah proved to be a natural with horses and begged Keith to teach her to ride like the ranch hands. James was quieter and more studious, preferring to spend hours with the books in Henry's library, learning everything he could about the world beyond the ranch. Clara was fearless and stubborn, with her father's determination and her mother's quick wit. Helena sometimes had to pinch herself to believe this was her life, that the desperate woman begging in the market was the same person who now stood at the window of a comfortable cabin, watching her husband teach their children to skip stones in the creek. She had never imagined she could be this happy, could feel this complete and at peace with the world. Keith felt the same way. He would come in from a long day of working cattle or mending fences to find Helena in the kitchen, cooking supper while humming to herself, and be struck by how blessed he was. He had saved money to buy small gifts for her over the years: a new shawl, a set of pearl earrings, a rocking chair for the porch, but the greatest gift they gave each other was simply their presence and their unwavering love. When Sarah turned 16, a young man from a neighboring ranch began calling on her, and Keith found himself in the strange position of being the protective father interrogating his daughter's suitor. Helena laughed at his gruffness and reminded him that Sarah was smart and capable, and they had raised her well. The young man, whose name was Thomas and who worked as a blacksmith's apprentice, was respectful and hardworking, and eventually even Keith had to admit he was a good match for their daughter. Henry Patterson lived to see all three of Keith and Helena's children grow into fine young adults. He passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, leaving the ranch to Keith in his will with a letter that explained Keith was like the son he never had, and there was no one else he trusted to carry on the legacy he and Clara had built. Keith wept when he read the letter, and Helena held him as he grieved for the man who had given him a chance and become family. Taking over the ranch was a huge responsibility, but Keith rose to the challenge with Helena by his side. They expanded the operation, adding sheep to the cattle and building a reputation for quality stock and fair dealing. James eventually went to university in California to study law, but always came home for holidays and long visits. Clara married a teacher from White Pine and settled in town, giving Helena and Keith their first grandchildren. Sarah married Thomas the blacksmith, and they built a house on the far edge of the ranch property so she could stay close to her family. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Keith took Helena back to White Pine and asked her to show him where she had been begging that day he first saw her. They stood in the market square, now much changed and modernized with the new century approaching, and Helena looked around with distant eyes. "I was right there," she said, pointing to a spot near the butcher shop. With my empty basket and my pride in tatters, wondering how I was going to feed Sarah that night, I was so scared and so desperate. She turned to look at Keith, her eyes shining with love. And then you walked up to me and changed everything. You gave me hope when I had none left. I was just a cowboy who saw someone who needed help, Keith said, though his voice was thick with emotion. I had no idea that helping you would be the best decision I ever made in my life. You have given me 20 years of happiness, Helena. 20 years of love and family and purpose. You made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. We made each other better, Helena said, echoing the words he had spoken on their wedding night 2 decades before. We saved each other, Keith, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. She kissed him there in the middle of the market square, not caring who saw them, and Keith held her close, grateful beyond words for the day fate had brought them together. They walked home hand in hand, taking the long way so they could enjoy the afternoon and each other's company. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and their plans for the future, about growing old together and all the adventures still to come. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and they stood on the porch of the main house, looking out over the land they had built a life on. You ever regret it? Keith asked suddenly. Marrying a cowboy instead of finding someone with more money or education or prospects. Helena turned to look at him in surprise. Keith Dalton, I have never regretted a single moment of our life together. You gave me and Sarah a home when we had nothing. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You have been the best husband and father anyone could ask for. How could I possibly regret any of that? I just want to make sure you are happy, Keith said softly. That has always been my goal, to make you happy. Then you have succeeded beyond your wildest dreams, Helena assured him, cupping his face in her hands. I am so happy, my love. So incredibly, wonderfully happy. And it is all because of you, because you saw me that day in the market and decided to help instead of walking past like everyone else. They went inside as the stars began to appear overhead, and Keith built a fire in the hearth while Helena made coffee. They sat together on the sofa that had once belonged to Henry and Clara, Helena's head resting on Keith's shoulder, and talked late into the night about all the blessings they had received and all the love they had shared. As the years continued to pass, Keith and Helena grew old together with grace and gratitude. Their children gave them more grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, and the ranch house was always full of noise and laughter during holidays and family gatherings. They never forgot where they had come from, the desperate day in the market that had brought them together, and they made a point of helping others in need whenever they could. Helena often thought back to that day, to the empty basket and the fear that had consumed her, and she marveled at how one act of kindness could change the entire course of a life. Keith had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else, had chosen to help when he could have walked past, and that single decision had created a love story that spanned decades and generations. Keith thought about it too, about the young woman with green eyes and an empty basket who had captured his heart the moment he saw her. He had not known then that he was falling in love, had not realized that helping her would lead to the greatest happiness he had ever known. But looking back, he could see the hand of fate in every moment, guiding him to that market square on that particular day so he could meet the woman who would become his whole world. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by 3 generations of family, with Sarah organizing the party and James giving a speech that had everyone in tears. Clara had brought photos from over the years, and they spent the evening looking through them, remembering all the moments big and small that had made up their life together. That night, After all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Keith and Helena sat on the porch of the cabin by the creek, holding hands and listening to the familiar sound of the water bubbling over rocks. They were both in their 70s now, their hair silver and their faces lined with age, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. "If I could go back and do it all again," Keith said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I would not change a single thing. Every moment with you has been a gift. Even the hard times," Helena asked with a smile. "There were plenty of those too." "Even the hard times," Keith confirmed, "because we faced them together and they made the good times even sweeter. You are the love of my life, Helena Dalton. You always have been and you always will be." "And you are mine," Helena replied, squeezing his hand. "My cowboy who filled my basket and walked me home and stayed by my side ever since. Thank you for choosing me that day, Keith. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible." "Thank you for letting me love you," Keith said. "Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars came out overhead, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The creek continued its eternal song, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted softly. Inside the main house, they could see lights in the windows as their grandchildren got ready for bed, continuing the legacy of love and family that Keith and Helena had created. Keith died peacefully at the age of 78, the same age Henry Patterson had been, with Helena holding his hand and whispering that she loved him. His passing left a hole in Helena's heart that nothing could fill, but she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the life they had built together, and the love that had sustained them for more than 5 decades. Helena lived for another 6 years, spending her final days surrounded by family in the house by the creek. Sarah moved in to care for her in those last months, and Helena spent her time telling stories about Keith and their life together, wanting to make sure the younger generations understood the kind of love they had shared and the miracle of their meeting. On a warm spring morning, with wildflowers blooming outside her window and the sound of the creek in her ears, Helena closed her eyes for the last time. Her last words were Keith's name, spoken with such love and longing that Sarah, who was sitting beside her, knew her mother was finally going to be reunited with the man she had loved for over half a century. They buried Helena next to Keith in the small cemetery on the edge of the ranch, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains. The headstone read, "Helena and Keith Dalton, beloved parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents." Their love story began with an empty basket and a kind heart, and it will echo through the generations forever. And it did echo through the generations. Their children told their grandchildren the story of how Keith had seen Helena begging in the market and had filled her basket with food before walking her home. The grandchildren told their children, and the great-grandchildren told their children, passing down the tale of kindness and love that had started it all. The ranch continued to thrive under the care of their descendants, and the cabin by the creek remained standing, a testament to the life Keith and Helena had built together. Visitors to the ranch often asked about the elderly couple in the old photographs that hung on the walls of the main house, and family members would smile and say, "That is great-grandma Helena and great-grandpa Keith. They had the greatest love story you ever heard." And they would tell the tale once more, about the young mother with an empty basket and the cowboy who filled it, about how one act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. They would talk about the hard times and the good times, about the children and grandchildren, and the legacy of compassion and love that Keith and Helena had left behind. The story became a part of the family's identity, A reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that kindness to strangers could change lives in ways beyond imagining. It reminded them to see people who others overlooked, to help when they could, to believe in second chances and the possibility of happiness even in the darkest moments. And so the love story of Keith and Helena Dalton lived on, not just in memory but in action, inspiring generation after generation to lead with kindness and to keep their hearts open to the possibility of love. The empty basket had been filled that day in the market square so long ago, but the ripples of that simple act continued to spread outward, touching lives and changing destinies long after Keith and Helena had passed from this world into the next. Their story proved that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made new each day through acts of care and devotion. It showed that families could be built on foundations of kindness and respect, and that the most profound love stories often began with the simplest gestures. Most importantly, it demonstrated that everyone deserves to be seen, to be helped, to be loved, regardless of their circumstances or station in life. The ranch still stands today, run by Keith and Helena's great-great-grandchildren, and visitors can still see the cabin by the creek where they made their home and raised their family. The market square in White Pine has changed beyond recognition, but there is a small plaque near where Helena once stood begging, telling the story of the young mother and the cowboy who changed each other's lives forever. And on warm summer evenings, when the light hits the mountains just right and the creek sings its ancient song, some say you can still feel the love that Keith and Helena shared, lingering in the air like the scent of wildflowers, reminding everyone who visits that true love never really dies. It transforms and continues, passing from generation to generation, inspiring new stories and new beginnings, just as it should. The tale of the empty basket and the full heart remains one of the most beloved stories in the family history, told and retold around dinner tables and at holiday gatherings, a reminder of where they all came from and the values that define them. And every time someone hears it for the first time, they are moved by the simple truth at its core, that kindness matters, that love transforms, and that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with a single step towards someone in need. Helena and Keith's love story was one for the ages, beginning in desperation and ending in fulfillment, spanning decades and touching countless lives. It was a testament to the power of choosing love over indifference, action over apathy, hope over despair. And it all started on that dusty day in the market square of White Pine, Nevada, when a cowboy saw a young mother begging with an empty basket and made the decision to fill it and walk her home, never knowing that he was starting a love story that would echo through time itself.